Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to you and thanks for joining us for another epic talk, this time in honour of International Women's Day. My name is Will Alton from Wiltshire Council, and I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the tech, and then I'll let Terence take over. So if you wish to see closed captions of speakers' words, then please click on the CC button at the bottom right hand of the screen, and then the words should appear after 30 seconds or so. The system sometimes takes a little while to get warmed up. If you're having any technical problems, the most common solution is to switch off and switch it on again. So please close your Teams or your browser and reopen it and click on the meeting link again that was sent through earlier. Other problems may be down to your home internet connection, or if you're hearing an echo, it may be that you have this event open in 2 or more windows. Okay, so that's enough for me, and I'll hand over to Terence.
Thanks, Will. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terence Herbert. I'm the Chief Executive of Wiltshire Council, and I'd like to welcome you to today's first online International Women's Day event. So a really big warm welcome to everybody that's chosen to join us today in marking International Women's Day 2021. Now, for us in Wiltshire, inclusion really is at the heart of building strong communities, and that's part of our council vision. It's one of the elements of our identity, which is a framework that reflects who we are as an organisation and how our staff are expected to work, how they lead and act with each other, with our partners, and importantly with our residents and our communities. Now, I feel very proud to lead an organisation which is dedicated to promoting inclusion for all people. Today, however, really is about recognising that women have fought long and hard for equality, and actually that fight continues today, be that in the workplace or in society in general. Therefore, it really is incumbent upon all of us to be allies of feminism, or to be feminists ourselves. Now, there will be a number of activities and events throughout the year which we hope you will take part in to celebrate the diversity of our community and our workforce. Now, that's more than enough from me, so I'm going to hand you over now to Claire Edgar, who's our Director for Learning Disabilities and Mental Health at Wiltshire, and she's the Chair of the Council's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Group. Claire.
Thanks, Terence, and welcome everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. International Women's Day was started in 1911, and as people will be aware, is a global day celebrating the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women across the globe. This day also marks a call to action in terms of accelerating gender equality. There'll be significant activity which is witnessed worldwide as groups come together to celebrate women's achievements and rally together for women's equality. So in terms of today, during our session, we're really keen to hear from everybody. So what we would like to do is make sure that you're able to let us know who's on the call and where you're from. In order to do that, we have the chat box function. That is at the top of the menu, and it is a small speech bubble. It would be great if people could start to access that and put in their name and perhaps where they're from as well. Thank you. And then after George's talk today, we'll have a question and answer session. That might be quite brief depending on the time, but we will really try hard to make sure that we ask all the questions and give George the time to answer them. So that if you are really keen to ask some questions of George, you can use the Q&A function. That is next to the chat button at the top of the menu, and it is a little speech bubble with a question mark in it. And what we'll do is we'll let George do her talk, and then if you continue to put the questions in there, at the end I will ask the questions to George. So thank you for that. What we're really conscious of is obviously time, so we may not get an opportunity to ask all the questions, and indeed George may not get the opportunity to answer them, but we will do our very best. Our plea really is today is just please can we remember to be polite and respectful during the questions. Thank you. For those of you that are on social media, please feel free to tweet any points from the talk today using the hashtags #EpicTalks, hashtag IWD2021, and hashtag choose to challenge. And please mention at Women's Day, at Wilts Council, and at Undeniably Epic. Thank you. So I would now like to introduce Georgina Brown, our speaker today. George is a TEDx speaker. She's equality, diversity and inclusion consultant, founder of BARDO, Inclusive Consultancy, and she's also head of equality, diversity and inclusion at the University of Bath. George specialises in behavioural change and has over 22 years experience of working on equality, diversity and inclusion projects with leading organisations. She graduated from the University of Bristol with a master's degree in strategic management in 2006 and has over 10 years experience of working on equality initiatives. Her portfolio has included the British Army, L'Oreal, Logica, the Home Office, European Parliament, universities, the NHS and the Borders and Immigration Agency. Now to today's talk. The campaign theme for International Women's Day 2021 is Choose to Challenge. Individually, we are all responsible for our own thoughts and actions all day, every day. We can choose to challenge and call out gender bias and inequality. We can choose to seek out and celebrate women's achievements. Collectively, we can all help create an inclusive world. We all have a role to play in inclusion and making sure inclusion becomes a reality. From challenge comes change, so let's us all choose change and challenge to make sure that we have shared responsibility to be allies and help society to move forward to become more inclusive. So without further ado, I would like to now hand over to George to talk to you about being a game changer and our shared responsibility. Thanks, George.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that lovely introduction. And thank you everyone for attending this talk on being a game changer. I'm feeling very privileged that so many of you have joined us today. As for some of you, I'm sure this will be the first day of freedom from homeschooling. So thank you very much indeed. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, basically, I'm going to start off by giving you a little bit of an overview, very light touch on the role that all of us can play in terms of being a game changer and making society more inclusive and equitable. In order to do that, we really need to start, first of all, to understand why. Why is it we're trying to change? Why does the world need game changers? Why is society still not capitalising on the diversity of thought, the richness of experience that we can all bring to it? And most importantly, why does this need all of us to be involved? Secondly, I'll touch on the what. So what it is we need to know in order to help things to change, to move things forward. And I'll give sort of a little bit of a light touch on a few models, processes and frameworks that can really help us to understand the knowledge we need to know. And then I will attempt to reveal the how. So how we can all play a role and how we can sort of like use some of these different tools that I've mentioned here to do this. But first of all, if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to take a quick trip down memory lane. Now, as a young girl, I have very fond memories of spending time with my late father. He fostered in me a keen interest in sports, in gardening and in horses. And on a Saturday afternoon, we would often watch Grandstand together. This was some very sort of cherished father-daughter time. And we would often sit there and he would fall asleep as he'd been working so hard throughout the week as his role of father, husband, but most importantly, as the role of provider. Now, it seems so obvious now, but back then there were lots of unwritten rules that I was really digesting. Unwritten rules about gender. Now, one of those rules was that to be a sports presenter, you had to be a white man. It was the time it was seen as very much an unwritten rule. Now, that's no disrespect to these wonderful men, because I have such great fond memories of watching Des Lynam and Frank Boff and others. But this rule was just so embedded into the fabric of life that it wasn't even seen, never mind about questioned. And one of my most profound childhood memories was basically when I had that sort of like feeling of shock as I sat there with Dad watching Grandstand and it was suddenly presented by a woman. Now, that was in 1990. and that was a real game changer. The woman was the late Helen Rollinson, who was raised in Bath, and she attended Bath High School for girls. She also played hockey for Somerset, and she really sort of like changed the accepted face of sports presenters. But she did not act alone. Helen would not have arrived for an interview at the BBC and said, "I'm a woman and I think women should present sports." She would have been dismissed so easily at that time. Helen faced a lot of rejection before she landed this role. And when she did finally get the opportunity, she would have been surrounded by other game changers that helped her to pave this way. So if we look at this pyramid, it would have started at the bottom there with basically those that recognised that they were being discriminated against. Then there's those who are in close proximity to her, who would have seen the discrimination themselves and would have been brave enough to call it out. Then they would become advocates of influence that would have raised the volume and really set the urgency and put that pressure on for change. Those individuals then would have been actively listened to, and others would have started to educate, first of all themselves, and then share that education with others. People in power would have then started to self-reflect and challenge their biases, being introspective to think, why do I think of it in that way? Gatekeepers, such as the recruiters and leaders, and in this particular case, the producers and the directors, would have had to muster up the courage, the huge courage it would have taken at that time to take a risk and take some action. The business case for doing this would have had to have been created and sold to those people in power. And that again takes great courage to have those brave conversations. Meanwhile, others would have been working in this case with Helen to mentor her, to get her to the point to believe in herself and that this change could happen. And then finally, the public, the customer, the end viewer, they would have all had to embrace that change. Now, all of this takes a long time. And let's not forget as well, there would have been women who had been chipping away at this, chipping away at the discrimination for many years previously. And other women pushing from the sides who also wanted this role, who just suddenly found this door was gradually becoming unlocked. But what this story highlights is that we all have that shared responsibility, a responsibility to play a progressive role in enabling life to change and develop. And one thing's for sure, change is inevitable. Cultures are always shifting. However, we are nervous of it. And when it's such a dramatic change that goes against our default norm of what's acceptable or appropriate or expected, such as in the Meghan and Harry situation, which is going on at the moment, it's even harder as we're forced to self-reflect. To self-reflect on what we've learned through life, such as our beliefs and why we've learned them. Now, where have we learnt what racism is and isn't? You know, when racism and sexism are so covert and insidious, who gets to name it? You know, intent is not seen as an excuse in law, impact is, and it's the same with ED&I. Isms are everywhere, sexism, racism, disableism, etc. And it's using unconscious bias training to challenge this alone is really not enough. We need to be able to embrace regular, deep introspection. And this is often quite a painful process as it challenges our beliefs in systems that we've often benefited from. However, if those systems carry on and if things happen over and over again, they gradually become normal. If we see the same things happening over again, it becomes normal. So, for example, in this example, if men are only able to read and report about sports, then at some point we actually unconsciously start to believe that all sports presenters have to be male. It becomes a default truth. So again, if we keep on seeing men as heads of corporations, it starts to seem natural then that only men should hold those positions. So now let's look at the why. Why are we trying to change that? What's wrong with that? Men are great in heads of positions, they're great as sports presenters. Why are we needing to change that? Well, we're trying to create an inclusive culture where everyone can be their authentic selves and thrive. And in that, actually be the best version of themselves and be able to contribute fully to society. Now, over time, the field of equality, diversity, inclusion has changed as we understand more and more about what is happening. So at the beginning, there was this sort of recognition that inequality existed and that there was unequal access to opportunities and that was the problem. This was addressed through equal opportunities work, where tools and assistance were distributed evenly to everyone. So as you can see here in point number 2, everyone's got the same ladder. Great. So everyone would have the same resources and meritocracy was born. But the reality was that was not providing meritocracy. When we started to look at creating equity, where individuals then were treated appropriately to the individual's needs. So that's when we start looking at things like reasonable adjustments. And that's what we can see in point 3 here. However, although this is still needed, it's now seen as a deficit model, where individual is still seen as the problem and the individual is seen as lesser. So we now start to understand equality through the lens of social justice. And that's where we look to fix the systems, the processes and the culture around the situation to ensure that that is free of the barriers and blocks for underrepresented groups. So what happens if we don't change? Well, if we take a look at this diagram of a typical organisation, the top of the iceberg shows what we see of the organisation, what they want us to see. So you've got the brand, the mission, the vision, the products, the structures and so forth. However, underneath the iceberg is what is really driving that visible system. So they're the invisible social codes, the values and the beliefs, the habitual processes, those shared assumptions, and the stories, the history that has created the culture of that organisation and feeds into the visible. So when this happens, for example, if you have a specialist clothing manufacturer and they are predominantly men in their product development team, will they be able to see the opportunities for their products in a diverse marketplace? They won't have that lived experience of what it is to be different. And a hint here, within this, shrink it and pink it is not the answer for all women. And unfortunately, that's a trap that many retailers do fall into. So as the world becomes more openly diverse, our insight and empathy needs to be able to grow to see the world from those different points of view. And the need to change in order for all of us to thrive and cater for the needs of those groups becomes more and more important. Now, biases are things which are completely natural. They are basically just shortcuts in the brain that we need to be able to function. If we had to think from scratch all the time for everything that we do, everything would take so long. However, these shortcuts can create a default belief that can be limiting both to ourselves, to others, and to wider society. So they need to be regularly sort of challenged. They can become outdated. So we need to do an upgrade, sort of like a software upgrade, so to speak, every so often. If we don't, then we can start creating mistakes. We start making assumptions based on falsehoods and then can create blocks and barriers. So we've established that change is inevitable, but the burden of that change and creating inclusion often falls then to the underrepresented groups who are already hurting. For example, here, there's a woman who has been held back by the structures and cultures of an organisation. Now, eventually, because of those continuous microaggressions, someone will get incredibly frustrated with that. And what happens is either someone will hide within an organisation, either by conforming to it, or actually becoming invisible within the organisation, or they will leave, or they'll break with the frustration of masking and having to challenge. And none of that is good for anyone. So as a talent leaves an organisation, the fixed majority mindset then becomes embedded even further. But when someone is forced to the point of breaking, when they risk then becoming sort of like labelled, because they will start performing to the majority stereotype of them. And that is true to all underrepresented groups, whether it's in terms of race, disability, LGBTQ+ community, because all of this is about basically in-group, out-group dynamics. So the responsibility for challenging and changing those limiting default norms has to fall to all of us. Otherwise, we end up in a vicious circle of stereotypes. Now, I often make the mistake of thinking that something that is obvious to me is just as obvious to everyone else. But we need our eyes opening to the discrimination around us. Take one of my former colleagues, Tony. They would tell me, I don't see what you mean by things being harder for women. Maybe in the past, but not now. Everything's fine now. For example, you have a higher position in this company than me. I did not understand how they could not see something that was just so evident around me. One day, Tony and I were going to see a new client. We walked into their conference room and met the client for the first time. I was slightly ahead of Tony and had my hand outstretched, ready to shake the client's hand. And the client was equally as eager to greet us and basically stretched out his hand as well. And he made eye and hand contact with Tony. So Tony looked at me surprised as he was forced into shaking the client's hand. But then I realised on his face there was this sort of like realisation that the client had believed Tony was the boss simply because he was a man. Now, a game changer doesn't have to be a radical activist. Any one of us in this scenario could have done something different to make that situation less awkward. You know, Tony could have been more aware of what was happening and avoid holding the gaze of the client and stepped back without reaching his hand. Tony could have introduced himself as the project assistant and directed the client to me as project director. We could have used preferred pronouns on our email signatures to avoid any confusion. The client could have been more aware of their own biases through self-reflection and keeping themselves in check. The client could have recruited and cleared the pipeline for more senior women within the organisation, so this was less unusual for him. Or I could have been more assertive and pushed forward. However, that last option then does play into the stereotypes of how a successful woman has to be bossy and pushy. So another colleague of mine, a very strong woman who's got a very sort of high-paying role in tech, has recently been placed on the executive board, one of only 2 women. Once in a board meeting, she had been sort of slighted by her boss, who had ignored her comments and then praised the same sentiments when they were voiced by a man. She wanted to speak up, she wanted to challenge her boss, but she didn't. Instead, after the meeting, she went to the bathroom and cried out of sheer frustration, and then she called me to vent about it. Now, the reason why she didn't want to speak up was because she could not afford to be seen as aggressive. So she let her resentments simmer. She also felt challenged by her femininity and her cultural heritage. Had her choice of clothes, jewellery or makeup that day meant that she wasn't taken quite so seriously. The sad truth is that when it comes to appearance in the workplace, the male look is the standard. It's the default norm for what professional looks like. So many sort of like women feel that the less feminine they are, the more likely they are to be taken seriously. So does a man go into a business meeting wondering if they're going to be taken seriously based on their clothes? I would hazard a guess it happened less frequently than it does for a woman. Now, I just want you to keep this scenario in mind, as this time I'm going to ask you what you think would have been the best way to respond. So if you've got your mobile phones with you, just pick up your mobile phones and log into www.menti.com, MENTI, and you'll be asked to enter a code. So if you can enter the code at the top of this slide, which is 6611205, you'll then be able to choose the answer that you think is most appropriate and hit the submit button. So if you could do that for me now, that'd be great. So basically, you've got 5 options here of what could have happened. The other woman who was also a female board member, could have spoken up and said something about what had happened. A male colleague on the board could have spoken up and expressed his concerns about what had happened and given the platform for the woman to speak. Or how many of you think that maybe she should have said something at the time and not got so emotional? Or perhaps she should have dressed more professional like a man to be taken seriously? Or should she just accept it? This is how it is. This is how things happen. At least the idea got taken forward. Okay, so I'll give a little bit longer for a few more responses to come through, but this is looking very encouraging. So it looks like a lot of you, 100% of you, 93% of you, 94, it's good, it's good. I've chosen the option, which is what I would say. It's basically, I believe that the only way that things can actually move forward is if we have sort of basically male equality allies acting as pro-social bystanders. And that's something we'll talk a little bit more about later. I think if the other woman had spoken up in that, again, it would have played into that stereotype about the woman being bossy and pushy, and men would have maybe switched off to that because that's the way that we're socially conditioned to. If she had said something in the actual meeting, would it have been heard? Would it have landed? Not being so emotional. No, it's something which, if you experience those microaggressions again and again and again, it's a bit like a mosquito, keep on stinging you. It gets to a point where actually you can't do anything but take it out in an emotional way. So we'll leave that one for the moment and move on. Society spends a lot of time teaching women how to be liked by men and appeal to that male gaze. And in doing so, really sort of like embeds the social codes of gender roles. Magazines are full of it. This is an old ad campaign which has been roasted by these sort of sexist adverts. And that's one quite good way of how to reverse gender roles, is really sort of like to see what it would look like if you were reversing the gender identity, and it can seem quite bizarre. But joking aside, we really are challenging hundreds of years of programming that all of us have been through, regardless of our gender. And the reinforcement of those gender roles really causes daily challenges for all genders. So women basically are meant to be softer, they're meant to bring a woman's touch, they're meant to be more ladylike, which means when we are more assertive, those who are around us who are not used to it, it can be labelled as aggressive or inappropriate. And barriers are often unconsciously put in the way of our progress, as this can then label us as being disruptive. So the frustrations of not allowing ourselves to be authentic, to have to repress and perform to a stereotype, is hard. And it means that we rarely then fulfill our true potential. But as I say, women are not the only genders to suffer with this. Society teaches boys to stifle their humanity, making masculine a very narrow construct that educates boys to be afraid of fear, of weakness, of vulnerability. And then this creates a mask of masculinity as well. This creates a huge binary situation between men and women, and it almost pitches us against each other if we don't perform to type, when it should be about freedom of choice. You know, if we choose to be a stay-at-home parent or a CEO, it should be what suits you best, regardless of your gender. And non-binary individuals, well, I think society unfortunately still has a hard job of recognising existence, never mind about seeing and acknowledging the challenges within that. So we all have that shared responsibility to see the burden that gender constructs place on all of us, how they prevent us from contributing, from innovating, and in some cases succeeding. To help others break free of how we should be recognised and actually recognise us for who we are, allowing our true authentic self to thrive without the weight of those gender expectations. Now, sexes are undeniably different biologically, but it's the socialisation of gender constructs that exaggerates those differences, creating a predominantly binary view of the world, which then limits all of us. Now, I can say, well, we could just say no to gender roles, couldn't we? And just be ourselves. Well, It's not actually that simple. We're all social beings and we internalize ideas from our socialization. At the University of Bath, colleagues of mine are currently researching the difference between the workplace of busy work versus valued work. Now, the gender differences in these promotable versus non-promotable tasks are quite stark. Research has demonstrated that there's a stress gap that clearly exists between women being twice as likely to suffer from severe stress and anxiety than men. The research has demonstrated that one of the reasons for this is that women are more likely to complete non-promotable and busy tasks in addition to their main role. Now, there are a number of reasons why this happens. Firstly, women are conditioned to volunteer more for these tasks to make people happy. Men are conditioned to step back and let women take those roles forward because that's what they're used to happening. And managers are socialised to expect women to volunteer for these tasks, so often request women to do it before they actually ask them to volunteer, because it's just quicker. But what the studies are demonstrating is that neither men or women really want to do these thankless tasks, and women are often just told to say no. Well, it's not as easy as it sounds, as what happens then is the work often comes back round to you, or it gets given to another woman who ends up picking up that work. And so it carries on. So other options need to be found. Managers need to maybe address what non-promotional tasks there are and check if they're being allocated without discrimination. Find alternative methods to volunteering. Examples of non-promotional tasks include things like work that supports others and the organisation but is often hidden. So building the presentation rather than just giving it. I'd like to point out I did build this presentation as well. Taking notes in a meeting, filling in for a colleague, serving on low-ranking committees, the office maintenance. These are all things which are in nobody's job descriptions but still need to get done. Another area that this research is looking at is the emotional labour, and that can disproportionately affect women as well. As society perceives women to be the caring gender, women often smile and calmly take tasks on that deal with emotional, sensitive issues that require that empathetic qualities, when actually they're masking their true feelings or are frustrated that they've yet again got to deal with this, taking them away from their other work. We often hear things like, why can't the male line managers just learn to deal with sensitive issues? Now, these are kind of the invisible discriminators that still exist within the workplace and mean that despite women's significant educational and general workplace advances, we still continue to find vastly different promotional trajectories for both men and women. Women will continue on the whole to progress less slowly than men if their portfolio of tasks really are around the less promotable tasks. So changing this dynamic needs to be a priority within organisations that really want to advance their most qualified employees. So if we now quickly move on to the what is going to help us change all of this? Now, there are a number of frameworks that we can look at, and this is by Professor John Cotter, who has developed basically the H-stage change management process, which many of you may be familiar with. It's really useful in framing any cultural change project, but also in terms of actually encouraging change just in everyday life. So the first thing is to create that sense of urgency, to help others to see the need for change, to demonstrate the importance of acting immediately, and build that business case for change that details the financial and reputational risks that exist. Secondly, building that guiding coalition. So getting that coalition of effective people to really sort of guide, coordinate and communicate activities, so your advocates. Thirdly, forming a very strong strategic vision and initiatives. So clarify how the future will be different from the past and how you can make that future a reality through those initiatives linked to that vision. Then enlist your army. So Large-scale change can only really start to occur if you've got a mass of people around it who start to see the need for it. They must have bought into it. They must have understood that sort of like drive to change and want to move in that same direction. Fifthly, enable action by removing barriers. Removing barriers such as ineffective processes, hierarchies, all of that is necessary to allow work to happen across silos and departments and to generate a real sort of impact. 6 is around generating the short-term wins. These are the molecules of the future success, the results, and you must recognise those and collate those and communicate those often in order to actually track progress and to energise that army and the volunteers. 7th is sustaining acceleration. So press harder after that first success. As your credibility increases, then basically policies and structures and systems will get better as well. So be relentless then with actually pushing that change and that vision of change forward. And then finally, institute that change. So articulate the connections between that new behaviour and organisational success, making sure that they become strong enough to replace old habits and are really embedded and sustainable. Now, in terms of equality, diversity, inclusion, this actually can be translated into an ED&I maturity model. Now, this is sort of like a roadmap towards inclusivity. It's a step change in maturity that I tend to use when working with organisations to help them to understand the levels of change needed to get towards a sustainable change. It's adapted from Deloitte's maturity model, and it demonstrates a pan-organisational requirement, that's shared responsibility to achieving true inclusion. Organisations need to progress from level 1 here, which is about being compliant and engaging in sort of ad hoc performative activities, to genuinely understanding the business case for diversity and inclusion and leading from the top as a business imperative, as the right thing to do. This is the only way that change can be embedded into an organisation throughout all of its systems, behaviours and structures, and leading to a sustainable organisation with a growth mindset that continues to think about inclusion. However, there are challenges. We need to be aware that most people don't like change. I don't like change. Most people, I suspect, listening to this will be wary of change. And a lot of individuals will be very wedded to the current culture and benefit from it. And whenever we start thinking about change, we tend to get defensive. We can feel that fear rising up in our solar plexus. This is John Fisher's transformational curve, and it demonstrates this perfectly. This dance that we have to perform when we're trying to embed cultural transformation. I believe my colleague Caroline Hickman spoke to you last year about eco-anxiety, COVID and climate psychology, and the psychology of ED&I is very similar. A growth mindset at individual level, departmental level and organisational level is needed to positively impact both the organisation and wider society. Now, some of you listening to this will be type 1 in this diagram. You will have a growth mindset naturally, and you will be thinking about this and thinking, yes, I know this, I get this, I'm going to be a game changer. And you'll possess that belief, that tenacity, that curiosity, and be inspired to take it on again. And you will be the ones that will lead the change. There will be some, type 2, that will think, okay, that's great, and will be fired up, but then actually do nothing. And then basically there will be the third type of person who won't think that this applies to them, that won't really believe in it, will be dismissing it and half listening with sort of a bit of a fixed mindset. And they'll go back into doing things that they've always been done until they are forced to change by wider society. Because eventually everyone is going to have to go through the transformational curve, whether it's about sustainability or whether it's about inclusion. As in cultures, they are always changing, they are always transient. There are things of which we've done and experienced within our lifetimes which will be deemed wholly unacceptable by younger generations. But that is also the beauty of life, the fact that it is always changing, it's always growing, and we're always learning from that. So we can either choose to embrace change, recognizing it won't be easy, and to go through feelings illustrated here from anxiety and guilt to denial, depression, but at the end destination, know it will be progressive and good, or we can ignore the change. And personally, I'd rather be brave and take steps forward than wait to be dragged kicking in streets screaming. But research by McKinsey and others has shown that there are two cultural shifts that are really propelling society to change, and they are sustainability and inclusion. Younger generations are choosing their brands, their places that they work. They're all choosing them based on how organisations perform against those two criteria, and they're not prepared to compromise. So what skill set do we need to be a leader of change? The game changers. What sets of skills do we have to grow in order to actually make sure we're taking this forward? Well, as I said, the growth mindset is essential. And this diagram maps out the key skills that are required when managing change. This has been adapted from Cotter, Cantor, Buchanan and Bodie and Dr. Brene Brown's work, and also includes some of the work that Deloitte have done around the 6 traits of an inclusive leader. I want to hone in just on one aspect of this, self-reflection. For me, this is the foundations of all inclusive work. BARDO, the name of my consultancy, is a Buddhist term for the 6 rounds of self-reflection that we go through without conscious judgment. It is this non-judgmental reflection that is required for us to be able to see our biases and assumptions and be able to let go of them and build a new understanding. But this takes great courage, and that is the key. Courage is the key to any change leader. So now let's look at the how. So how can we basically take all of this and contribute? How can we go about becoming a game changer? How do we make difference? Well, the one thing it starts with is a commitment from all of you. There are lots of ways for you to be a game changer, whether you are working in an organisation, want to be a radical activist, or simply want women to be seen for who they are. The partnership model. This involves getting closer, basically, getting out of your echo chamber of the same voices and the same opinions that reinforce your default norm. This is something we're really subjected to within social media and within the internet, because the algorithms just keep on giving us the same commentary, the same understanding and insights that we put out there. So we become an echo chamber of our own thoughts. So building relationships that gain insight and build empathy, where you start to see the exclusions that are being experienced by others, and then you can build that empathy in order to actually adapt and sustain growth. This can be to an individual or a business. For example, someone who wants to understand another point of view, push yourself into their world. Or a marketing department, for example, that needs to review materials through an inclusive lens. Another way that we can do is by being a pro-social bystander. And this is quite an easy thing to remember, the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. It's a simple way of remembering that if you witness something that's inappropriate behaviours, there's 5 things you could do. You could either take direct action, if it's safe to do so, say something, but always with kindness and call it out. Delay, so wait for the situation to pass, check on the individual involved, and then take action later once you've had time to consider. Distraction, indirectly intervene by distracting the situation, maybe by changing the focus or the subject. Delegation, maybe inform somebody else who has more social power and authority. And document, just record what has happened to support any future activity. Another thing we can do is becoming an equality ally. Now, being an equality ally involves actively getting involved. So I've set up a number of ally networks within organisations over the years, and these are key to ensure that you understand. So actively listening, consciously educating yourself continuously about diversity and inclusion, speaking up for others but not over others, so providing a platform for them but not belittling what has already been said, being respectful and being kind, using inclusive language and recognizing that language is transient and ever changing. Avoid rationalizing bad behavior or explaining away limiting structures or processes. Believe. This is a really important one. Even if you've never experienced something, believe that this could be an experience that others are going through. Understand your privilege, not as something to feel guilty about, but just to understand it and use that then to elevate and raise others' voices. And it's fine, you will make mistakes. This is something that just acknowledge and learn from, but don't make that apology then about you. This is about other people. So self-reflection, as I've mentioned previously, to me is one of the most important parts of inclusion. It's the cornerstone of inclusion. So there are thousands of tools on the internet to help you do this. I mean, these are just a few of my favourites. The Council of Europe has a great website dedicated to stopping sexism. Forbes regularly highlights research and publishes articles around how sexism and other isms limit business and society. It's also important to recognise the intersectionality of our labels and how this then increases the impact. So, for example, a Black disabled woman would have the burden basically of all three sets of biases against her and how we actually deal with that. I mentioned basically understanding our privilege, and self-reflection, although it can be painful, it's something by understanding it we can actually reinterpret how we are able to deal with situations. So Peggy McIntosh does this wonderful exercise where you can visualize your privileges as tools in a backpack. And these tools that can help you get through life. So some people might have more than others. But for example, if you had a matchbox in your backpack and a colleague needed a match, you would share it. Well, that's all that's being asked of privileges, to recognise that basically you might have more than others and how we can actually share these so that we can all be the best people that we can be. And finally, you can build a campaign. If you wanted to, for example, change a law that you perceive to be discriminatory or introduce a new law, such as Gina Martin did with the upskirting law, or it could be to support a group of individuals where, for example, COVID has affected them more disproportionately than others, or it could be a social change campaign to recruit more male nursery staffs on a large scale, or the Me Too movement. Or it could be for a company to embark on a campaign to help the wider society to progress, such as Procter & Gamble have done with their hashtag Talk About Bias. However, this needs to be sure that it's not performative. It is actually something that genuinely reflects the values of the organisation. Whatever your individual case, this framework can actually help you to create that type of campaign. So if we're talking about awareness, advocacy and action. There is a problem with gender equity, and we can all do better. Whether we are male, female, non-binary, we can all act as feminists, as allies, people who believe in the social, political and economic equalities of sexes. That's all we're asking for. So finally, if you pick up your phones again and log back into Menti, or you should already still be logged in, and put the code in again at the top if you haven't, this is the final question, of which there are a number of answers that you can put in, and you can choose more than one. So what will you do? Will you learn to see the invisible discriminators getting closer to underrepresented groups by gaining insight and building empathy? Will you be a pro-social bystander, calling out inappropriate behaviour, practice and/or language? Will you become an equality ally, responding to micro and macroaggressions? Will you regularly challenge your default thinking through self-reflection and become, or would you become a campaign activist? Are you going to do none of the above, or are you going to do all of the above? Okay, so that's quite encouraging, with over 50% saying that you're going to do all of the options. Nobody's going to do nothing, which is fabulous. That's what this is all about. And it's understanding what you would feel comfortable with, how you basically want to feel that you're playing a role in being a game changer. So on that note, I want to say thank you so much for listening and participating in this talk. And remember that we're all game changers and have a role to play. And I look forward to creating a more inclusive society with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, George. That was brilliant. Really, really interesting. And thank you for the surveys. That was really interesting to see people's results coming through there. So we've got a couple of questions for you. The first one is from Jenny. And Jenny was asking around the number of meetings are online, obviously, as a result of the pandemic. She was observing that many women appear to feel that it's tricky for them to speak up. And she was wondering if you had any tips to enable women to talk more on online meetings.
So I think this is around, again, sort of like creating a culture, and it's something of which a lot of line managers, there's a lot of techniques out there to try and actually help to get people to speak up who might feel that they don't have the opportunity to, or they don't have the platforms to. So having sort of like line managers training around that, it's like we're talking about understanding different ways that people can volunteer, ask for volunteers. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of actually setting the scene. So, for example, at the beginning of all of our sort of like Teams and Zoom meetings, we always try and actually set the scene that this is a very sort of like different world that we're living in at the moment, and that there is the diversity of life out there. So if basically a pet wanders in, that's absolutely fine. If the children need sort of like something and are wandering in the room, that's absolutely fine. So it's that scene setting at the beginning that people can do to make people feel at ease, that this is not basically just one way of dealing with things. And then it's basically being able to give sort of like a voice to people, to actually ask them if there's anyone who wants to contribute to this, giving them other options, if like within sort of like the 5Ds, if they want to contribute afterwards. So if they didn't feel comfortable at that time, there's giving a mechanism for them to come back afterwards. So I think there's lots of tools there. It's just making sure that we're equipping line managers with those tools.
Thanks, George. That's really helpful. And then one of the other questions, and it's actually caused a bit of debate and discussion in the chat, is from Carly, and she just references the poll, the first poll that you did, and she was just saying that do you think having men speak up on behalf of women in the scenario that you laid out earlier is actually putting men in a position where they could be viewed as the saviour of women, and would it not be more appropriate for women to speak up in those situations themselves, even at the risk of being accused of being bossy or aggressive?
So this is a really interesting one, and it plays into also what we call white saviour complex. And this is where we're saying that the man should not speak on behalf of the woman. That is a definite no, because that does play exactly into that stereotype. This is basically where the man draws attention to it and then gives a platform for the woman to speak. So it's not something where we're asking men to speak on behalf of women. It's just to highlight when something has happened and then give the opportunity to speak there. So yes, there are some very sort of good arguments for women calling it out as well. And I will, if I see it, I will call it out, because that, not only is it my job, it's my temperament as well that I will do. But if it does sort of like come to a situation where there is nobody who has that kind of personality, having a man to call it out and then give the opportunity for somebody else to speak, it is sort of like the best practice way to go.
Thank you, that's really interesting. I wonder if there'd be more comments raised in the Q&A around that. And then Lauren's asked, do you have any reading recommendations for people who are wanting to learn more in this area?
Yes. I have so many books of which I could recommend out there. Invisible Woman by Caroline, I can't remember her surname off the top of my head, but I can certainly share that with you afterwards. Invisible Woman is a phenomenal piece of work which basically goes through sort of like where women are not seen within society, and it goes through right the way through from the research of things like, for example, test crash dummies, and how basically they are very much, you know, in the male 30-year-old man shape, right the way through to sort of like skin products, and how the base level of a lot of scientific research is very much on sort of like the male physiology and how women are not seen within that. And then it also touches on in terms of how the same can be said for race and the intersectionality of that. So that's one really good book. There's so many out there in terms of how we look at inclusion, you know, how to be an inclusive leader, how to basically, why I'm no longer talking about race to white people by Renee. That's another really good book. But I'm more than happy to share my biography of all the different books that I would recommend there with you afterwards.
That would be great. Thanks, George. That's really helpful. Happy to share that across the group if we can going forward. Thank you. Yeah, and I think in terms of time, if that's okay, apologies everybody, but I'll draw the session to a close. But I just wanted to say thank you again to George for your talk today. It's been truly inspirational in terms of having us think carefully about our role in terms of the way we are as game changers ourselves as individuals. So thank you for that. And indeed, thank you everybody who's been on the call today. Thanks for your questions and your participation today. It's been really, really interesting. And I'll just hand you over to Will. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks very much, everybody. And that's the end of the webinar. Thanks so much. Goodbye.